Hi, this is a visual depiction as to how money has moved around the accounts at Dryden Court and how compensation has been inaccurately apportioned for the new communal boilers. In the first half of this video, I will show the mechanics of the errors, and in the second half provide the supporting figures. In this example, we have 3 leaseholders who each contribute equally to the reserve fund. Marion and Alan are connected to the communal boiler, but Penny is not. The reserve fund has £300 in, and each of these 3 leaseholders has £200 in their bank account. When the communal boiler of Dryden Court 1 failed in 2015 and required replacing, it was logical for the reserve fund to lend money to the boiler fund, and in this example here it's £300. Marion and Alan then received a brand new boiler, but it was recognised by KFH, the managing agent at the time, that Penny, who had contributed to the reserve fund but was not connected to the communal boiler, should be compensated, in this example, by a third of £300, i.e. £100. Unfortunately, KFH was then fired. Just 6 years later, on the 22nd of March 2021, the new managing agent, RMG, distributed a letter from Alan and Marion stating that compensation would be paid. In the letter, they said everyone would pay a minimum amount to the reserve fund in the year ending March 2022, and those connected to the communal boilers, such as Alan and Marion, would pay extra into the boiler fund. The boiler fund, in return, would return their money to the reserve fund. So what happened was, in this year, Alan and Marion paid an extra £20 to the boiler fund, and that money was moved across to the reserve fund. But hey, there's a problem here. Penny is due £100 of compensation, and there's only £40 being put back into the reserve fund. And why £40 when it was originally £300 in the loan? Well, let's go back and see how the calculation was made. First of all, instead of stating that the loan was £300, it was accidentally calculated that it would be £240, and a third of £240 would be £80. Therefore, it would be logical for Marion to give £40 to Penny and Alan to give £40 to Penny. And in that way, Penny is at least compensated by £80 rather than the £100 she was due. But that didn't happen. What they wanted to do was put the £40 into the reserve fund. Now, when that happens, Penny only owns a third of the reserve fund, and so a third of £80 is £27. She has been left £73 out of pocket. So clearly that was wrong. The second mistake was not only to state that the capital sum was 240, but to change the proportion. Instead of saying Penny is owed a third, they said, well, Penny should only be paid a sixth. Well, a sixth of 240, with the new revised smaller sum, would be just £40. So Marion could have paid Penny £20 and Alan could have paid Penny £20, and she would have received £40 of compensation. But in reality, what they did was put that money into the reserve fund. Consequently, Penny only receives a third of £40 as compensation, which would be £13. She is now £87 out of pocket. There was an alternative method for compensating Penny. Marion could have paid £150 to the reserve fund, and Alan could have paid £150 to the reserve fund. Now, the reserve fund has £300, and Penny has been indirectly compensated by £100. But this didn't happen. So now let's look at the actual figures. There are 3 elements that have to be understood. The first is how much is the principal sum. The second is how much is the percentage. And the third is into which account the money should be paid. Now, we know that the reserve fund lent to the boiler fund £258,000. Unfortunately, when they were making the calculation for how much compensation should be paid, they used the smaller figure of 173,147, as they felt that other people should pay for the removal of the asbestos around the boilers. This was an error, and it should have been 258,000. The second point is the percentage. Marion and Allen and the other leaseholders who are connected to the communal boiler should pay 100% of the loan, 258,000, back to the reserve. Or alternatively, they could pay Penny directly, which would be a smaller sum. So let's work through these figures. Marion and Allen each pay 2.39% of the communal boiler's running costs, which means both of them should pay 2.39% of 258,000. That works out at 6,184 each, which is the amount that they should have paid into the reserve fund. Unfortunately, because they worked with the smaller figure, and instead of working with 100%, they felt that 25.69% was the right figure, they only actually paid 1,065. Now this was a very good deal for them, because it meant both of them were £5,119 better off. Let's look at how Penny has dealt with this. She owns 0.7% of the reserve fund. So 0.7% of 258,000, and that's how much compensation she should have received. We know that 44,000 has already been paid into the reserve fund. That money could now be returned back to the boiler fund so a more accurate and clear calculation can be made. The amount of money borrowed by the boiler fund is not in question. It's 258,237. Now, instead of Marion and Allen paying 100% into the reserve fund, what they could do is pay Penny and the other 36 leaseholders directly. This would mean paying just 36% of 258,000, which would in fact be 95,281. This helps enormously in reducing the amount of money Marion and Allen have to pay, but does ensure that Penny and the 36 others are correctly compensated. Now, we established earlier that Penny owns 0.707% of the reserve fund, 0.7% of 36%, which amazingly gives us 1.9188%, and 1.9188% gives us the same sum as we had before, which is £1,828 of compensation. It means for Marion Allen a much better scenario. We've already established that they both have paid 1,065 towards the boiler costs. Now they simply have to pay 2,281 in total, which means both of them will only have to pay an extra £1,200 to have the account settled. And Penny receives her £1,828. No one is disputing this sum that was loaned to the boiler fund, and it's simply a matter of whether you want to pay 100% from these two and all those connected to the communal boiler to the reserve fund, or whether you want to pay 36% and send that money directly to these leaseholders.